get started here. Dr. Placey must be delayed somewhere, so I don't know where she is, so it's a little bit after 9.
I think she's getting breakfast for everyone.
Pardon?
I think she's getting breakfast for everyone.
Oh, okay. So welcome to our first seminar of the spring semester. Spring doesn't sound quite right, does it? So we're happy to have Dr. Cholewa speaking with us this morning. Some of you haven't met him yet. Dr. Cholewa is one of our new instructors here teaching in the exercise science for us this year. He's from Vermont?
No. Close.
Wait a minute.
Right region.
I can't remember. How do I just went blank? What state? Where's
Connecticut.
Connecticut, okay. So I'm going to let him introduce his topic to you this morning, so I wasn't prepared to speak about this. So, Dr. Cholewa.
Thanks. Let's see if get these lights.
Yeah.
Just there we go. Cool. All right. So, this is my dissertation study. It's titled "The Effects of Betaine Supplementation on Strength, Body Composition, and Homocysteine Phenolactone." Really? It was working 2 minutes ago. All right. So, since I was like 5 years old, I've always kind of wondered how this worked. How did Popeye eat spinach and get superhuman strength? There's not a lot of protein in spinach, a little bit of iron. So I thought it'd be a cool idea to investigate this. And as I was going through the literature, that's where I came across betaine. And betaine is trimethylglycine. It's an amino acid with 3 methyl groups. So that N is. We'll just call it betaine. It was first discovered in sugar beets. It's also really rich in green leafy vegetables, such as spinach. So kind of made me think, well, maybe that's how Popeye gets his strength. It's isolated from sugar beets. It's an organic osmolyte, which means it sucks water into it. When we were putting together these capsules for the dissertation study, if you left even like, I don't know, a little pile of it on the table, and it was a humid day, you came back 10 minutes later and there was just a pool of water. That's how much of an osmolyte it is. It just pulls water in. It's a major methyl donor, and they use it in, for feed, as a feed additive to help increase the lean mass to fat ratio, especially in pigs and chickens. So a lot of the research I found was in animals. So there's limited research in human studies. And what you see here, these numbers, are just the studies I found at the time that corresponded to what I was looking at. So in humans, we saw conflicting results with regards to strength and power. And I'll show that in a little more detail in a second. With betaine and body composition, increasing lean mass, decreasing fat mass, or both. No effects in sedentary subjects, but only 2 studies have been done. One was long-term and one was over the course of 10 days. Betaine in hypertrophy, there was nothing in humans. There was one study that came out of Yukon that saw increases in growth hormone, IGF-1, and AKT, which is part of the mTOR pathway, which we'll look at. And then betaine and homocysteine, and there's a good wealth of information on that, especially in the clinical literature. In animals, though, stuff is amazing. It improves body composition. All the pig studies done have shown improvements in body composition. More lean mass, less fat mass upon slaughter. There's been several studies that shows it increases growth hormone and IGF-1 in animals. They think that betaine is absorbed into the hypothalamus and contributes to GH production that way. Betaine in lipogenesis, or the building of fat mass. It reduces enzymatic activity, it reduces gene expression. This was found in both pigs and chickens. And then betaine and beta oxidation, or your ability to burn fats as fuel. We saw an increase in intramuscular carnitine and intramuscular carnitine palmityl transferase. It's the enzyme needed to bring fatty acids into the mitochondria to oxidize them. Saw an increase in hormosensitive lipase activity around the skeletal muscle. And an increase in CPT activity as well. So it showed some promise. So we looked at two studies that we'll talk about. The first was Lee et al. It looked at the effects of betaine on strength and performance. And it was a short-term study. It was done over 12 days. It was crossover. 12 recreationally trained males had to be training for 3 months. They saw an increase in maximal effort bench press and squat, so increased strength. Saw an increase in vertical jump and throw power, so an increase in power, and an increase in recovery. There was no difference in repetitions to failure or work capacity. There was no differences in body weight or hydration, and no differences in hematocrit, hemoglobin, or osmolality. So we're not seeing much outside of the cell as far as betaine being an osmolarity. Second mechanism, or the first mechanism of action that was proposed is that betaine might increase creatine synthesis. So here's betaine right here. You ingest it, you get an increase in methyl groups. Ingest betaine, increase in methyl groups. That's nice. And we require methyl groups to synthesize creatine. So that was their thought. We're seeing an increase in strength and power. Maybe this is how it happens, by increasing creatine. Of course, in creatine supplementation studies, there's almost always an increase in strength or power. So, Delfabro et al. Looked at this, and he took 4 groups. Took a placebo-only group, a betaine group, a creatine group, and a creatine and betaine group. There was no training protocol. Subjects did not train at all during this study. There was 10 days of treatment, and all the testing took place over 16 days. The body composition took place right after the study. This is what I didn't like about his study, is that he tested 1 repetition maximum bench press and squat 3 days following the cessation of treatment. And then he tested work capacity and power 6 days following the treatment. So we don't know what the effects of betaine are causing, we don't know if the betaine, I guess, wore off after you stopped taking it. I guess that's the best way to say it. In any case, they didn't find anything. And no increases in strength, no increases in power, no difference in body composition, and no difference in muscle phosphocreatine. And the muscle PCR was taken right at the end of the study, so either betaine requires a longer period of time to improve creatine synthesis, or it doesn't work via creatine synthesis. And there were no differences between creatine or creatine plus betaine for any of those variables, which leads us to believe that betaine doesn't work synergistically with creatine. So betaine and homocysteine thiolactone. This is the crux of my study. So high plasma homocysteine, or HCY. It's a clinical condition, and it leads to some negative effects. It's been implicated in atherosclerosis, inflammation, neurodegenerative disease, and insulin resistance. And having high levels of homocysteine also increase levels of homocysteine thiolactone. And here's how betaine plays into this. Here we have the methyl cycle. Homocysteine is transmethylated by either betaine or folate to convert it into methionine. Methionine then joins or combines with ATP to produce S-adenylmethionine, or SAM. And then that methyl group is used for a number of different things, such as producing creatine, as we saw on the slide before, producing the phosphatidylcholine for very low density lipoprotein synthesis, et cetera, et cetera. So the greater the demand for methyl groups, the more homocysteine that's created. And if this homocysteine is not dealt with, it's either going to turn into homocysteine thiolactone or cause some other negative effects. So in plenty of studies, we've seen that betaine supplementation reduces plasma homocysteine. And here we see the cycle again. See the SAM used to create very low density lipoprotein. And if the homocysteine isn't dealt with, isn't transmethylated, it can form homocysteine thiolactone. Well, this homocysteine thiolactone has some negative effects. And I'm not going to pronounce their name, but they looked at the effects of HCTL on protein synthesis. So what they found was the HCTL inhibited insulin-mediated P70S6K phosphorylation, which is one of the steps in protein synthesis. So HCTL inhibited protein synthesis. HCTL inhibited protein synthesis with insulin in the mixture. Insulin is a very anabolic hormone. It stimulates protein synthesis, so HCTL inhibited that. And it inhibited it on several different levels, and one of the reasons they thought was due to oxidative stress. Keep in mind, all this was done in liver cells, not muscle cells. So I'm making a little quantum leap here. So the conclusion was that HCTL blocked insulin-stimulated protein synthesis. And I also found that homocysteine itself upregulated resistin production, and resistin is also involved in insulin resistance. So here we see the mechanisms of hypertrophy on a cellular level. You have the insulin receptor, or insulin binding to insulin receptor substrate, and then you have two downstream actions. One is the mTOR pathway, heading toward protein synthesis, and the other is the mitogen activated protein kinase pathway right here, heading toward gene expression and cell growth and differentiation. And what they found was that HCTL reduced or inhibited these two pathways, which would lead to less protein synthesis, and if we thought about it in terms of skeletal muscle, less muscle growth. So I looked into research, and just from my own experience with working with athletes, especially strength athletes, I found that there's a high prevalence of homocysteinuria in athletes. In other words, they have higher levels of homocysteine. And weight trainers generally consume excess methionine and inadequate folate and betaine. A lot of protein sources, not a lot of fruits and vegetables. And that compromises the transmethylation pathway. Or in other words, we're not getting rid of that homocysteine. We're not methylating it back to methionine. And if HCY, or homocysteine, is elevated, then homocysteine thiolactone should also be elevated because there's a direct relationship between the two. And if that's elevated, it's likely going to reduce insulin receptor signaling and thus reduce protein synthesis. So we'll see a decrease in mRNA expression of protein synthesis, and likely also a decrease in glucose uptake and glycogen synthesis. So my thought was that because betaine decreases, well, they found a decreased homocysteine thiolactone in some clinical patients, maybe it'll do the same thing in healthy adults. Hasn't been evaluated yet in healthy adults. Because strength athletes have elevated HCTL, which was my hypothesis, the betaine should reduce that HCTL by increasing the transmethylation pathway. and lead to improved signaling and greater muscle growth. So in my review of LIT, this is what I found. As far as more work needs to be done, no one looked at the long-term effects of betaine on performance. Everything was 10 to 14 days in length. No one really gave their subjects a good resistance training program. A lot of times the subjects were instructed either not to train or trained like once a week. None of them had highly trained subjects. It was always in recreationally active, not people who had a lot of experience lifting weights. And I want to see, look further into the mechanisms whereby betaine might be ergogenic or increase muscle growth. So the study purpose, just to kind of restate it, determine if betaine supplementation will improve performance and body composition in weight-trained men, and to see if HCTL has a relationship between the improvements in body composition.